going to speak to you about working with the fairies. It's important if you want to work with otherworldly beings that you know who you are working with. Therefore it's useful to classify the beings of the other realms. First we have to recognise the difference between fairies, gnomes, earth spirits, ancestral spirits, ghosts, and house spirits and domestic spirits. First I'll begin by discussing gnomes and dwarves. Firstly, gnomes is a much later word, and it was first mentioned by Paracelsus sometime around the 1600s, I do believe, and came from the Latin, which was genome, which meant earth dweller. The earliest Germanic word was dwarf, or djorg, or dvjorg. You love my German accent there. Ja, das ist gut. Das ist sehr gut, ja. My German accent is not that good, I just put it on quite thickly. Okay, so the dvjorg or the dvargo. These live in mountains and caves and underground, and they are said to help with wealth and to guard treasure, and also to lead humans to find treasure, such as the legend of the kobolds from Germany. And the kobold live in mines, and the word translates as knockers, and they are said to lead miners towards rich veins of mineral by knocking within the mine, so you could hear them knocking. Now, sound is often associated with fairy, and also with poltergeists and things that go bump in the night. But the fairies can be often heard as music or as bells far away. The difference between gnomes and fairies and elves and water spirits are basically elemental. The dwarfs, of course, are earth dwellers, and they are not especially benign to human beings, although sometimes they will help them, but I think you have to earn a dwarf's help when it comes to wealth. Of course, you can do this by offerings and gifts and respect. They are mentioned quite often in the Prose Edda, and there are many names for dwarves, but we do have the names Nordri, Sudri, Ostri and Vestri, who are the dwarves of the four directions of north, south, east and west. And they hold up the pillars of the world. So these four dwarves are the dwarves which hold up the four corners of the world. So if you're working with wealth, it might be quite good to invoke these four dwarves of Nordri, Sudri, Ostri and Vestri to help you in the four directions. Now next we have air spirits, which are the sylphs of air, and they come down in storms and are blown in on winds. Quite often they're very distant from humans, but a big storm can blow them in. So you can work with the air spirits and they will help to blow away the chaff of your life and bring in fresh new inspiration. So they're very much on the mental plane. And then the other elementals, of course, we have water sylphs. These can be found in rivers, lakes and waterfalls. And they work with healing your emotions and helping to heal you of your sadness. They're very understanding, they're very compassionate, and they understand human sadness. And then we have the fire spirits, and the fire spirits are the salamanders, and they help humans with willpower and power in the world and material things. So you can work with fire spirits when you want to bring about fast transformation. They change things from one state to another very quickly. There are other names for spirits, and I have a list here, excuse me if I look down. So in Welsh they're called the Bwbach. In Yorkshire and the north of England they're called hobs. In Scotland they're called arusks. In Greek they're called the chalybes. In Manx they're called the phenodori. I didn't say that right. Phenodiri. In Britain and Cornwall and the southern parts of Britain they're called brownies and piskies. In Ireland they're called pukas. In the Midlands here they're called Robin Good Fellows, which is where we get our myth of Robin Hood. And then there are other classifications of spirits such as the Selkies, who are in Scotland and Ireland. They are grey spirits, but their name also means seal spirits, so they are shapeshifters. And they're very much like mermaids, and of course there are many classifications of spirits, so I won't go into them all. There's just an example of what we're working with. But these are names for fairies, and generally fairies have many names, and we don't particularly call them fairies. They've got euphemisms. We call them the good neighbours or the little people, and this is done out of respect. If you can name a spirit, then you have power over it, and this can be found in the story of Rumpelstiltskin. And Rumpelstiltskin actually means a little rattling post, so he's a wicked spirit. He's akin to a poltergeist. He's not a particularly beneficial spirit to work with, which is why in naming him he is sent away. It's important that if you agree to work with a spirit, you agree on a gift or an exchange, but never give anything that you're not prepared to give. In the story of Rumpelstiltskin actually asks for the firstborn child, and the poor heroine has nothing more to give, and Rumpelstiltskin names his price, which she actually says she has no more to give at this point, but it's a bargain made with himself, by himself. But if you do make a bargain, then follow through and give a gift for any beneficial action you may receive from fairies and from the elves and from the dwarves. Now moving along to the elves. The elves are much more Scandinavian and are believed in Iceland to this day. There's a recent story about a road that was moved so that it did not go through elven rocks and disturb the elves. So they're very respectful even to this day, and they're very suspicious and don't want to invoke any bad luck from the elves, even in the modern era. There are light elves and there are dark elves. The light elves were described, that was my fire crackling, sorry. The light elves were described by Snorri Sturluson as belonging to the heaven, or living in the heavens, while the dark elves lived in the earth. And he was very much influenced by Christianity at that time, although in Iceland Christianity and heathenism coexisted well into, I think it's the 13th, 14th century, which is quite late in Europe. And they coexisted peacefully side by side. So the light elves were akin to angels and the dark elves were akin to earth dwellers and nature spirits that lived below the land. They're said to live in hills, and you'll find many hills and places around England and Scotland that are named Eldon or Eildon or Alden, and they mean Elf Hill. And quite often in these places there are also hill forts and old prehistoric burial mounds and things like this. So there arose the theory that when our ancestors were talking of elves, they were actually talking of prehistoric and much older races, Neolithic races, due to the fact that many of the tiny flint arrowheads that may have been found around these sites could actually have belonged to Neolithic ancestors, or Iron Age ancestors, Bronze Age ancestors. But they are also related to ancestors in the idea that when a person dies, they can actually go on into the elven realm and become an elf themselves. So when we're talking of elves, we're not only talking of supernatural beings, but also our own family and our own ancestors. They are called elf after the Old English, Old Germanic words elf or alba, which means white, which we take to mean shining, bright, light beings. This is the root of the word Albion and albino, and Alf was quite often used as a name in Anglo-Saxon Britain. So Alfred and Alfrith were all blessed by the elves, which shows that they had quite high esteem for elves in those days. You can hear my fire crackling, that's just ignore that. Okay, so there are also divisions that have been named. In Scotland they're called the Seelie and the Unseelie courts. Now the Seelie court are quite beneficial and are kind and loving to human beings, and they grant boons and give gifts and forgiving. If you offend a member of the Seelie courts, they're quite likely to forgive you, whereas if you offend a member of the Unseelie court, they will be malevolent. So the Seelie court appear around dusk, especially around twilight, and also at dawn, but in between places and in between times. So they live on seashores, they live on hedgerows, they live between village and the countryside, they live on the edge of the forest and the plain. They like in between times and in between places. And they are very much the summer fairies. Now the Unseelie court are winter fairies, and these can be seen at midnight in the dark. They are the ghosts that scare travellers, and they're quite malevolent and they're quite trickstery. So they were divided between the Seelie and the Unseelie. And also the Seelie court would change location every 6 months, so it is the Seelie court that move at Beltane and at Samhain in their troops, and it is the Unseelie court who are the wild and winter fairies. They're the spirits that scare you and come into your home at winter. Now W.B. Yeats also categorised them as the trooping fairies and the solitary fairies. So the trooping fairies were kind and noble and generous and moved together in large crowds, and this is the origin of the wild hunt, where they fly across the countryside at night riding their horses. And actually in Scotland you would not obscure a troop of fairies coming through your house and along their fairy paths, so it was quite traditional to have a front door and a back door that was in line, so that the fairies could pass through on their fairy path without any obstruction. If you put doors out of alignment, you were obstructing the fairy path and it would cause your home problems. So they were the trooping fairies, which you may have heard of, and then he divided them into the solitary fairies. Now the solitary fairies were a little more mischievous and a little more trickstery. Although they could be kind, they were more inclined to play tricks. And Catherine Briggs later divided the solitary fairy into the malevolent fairy and the domestic solitary fairy. So the domestic solitary fairy would be the being that dwelt in your house. Quite often they would dwell outside in summer and come into your home in the winter, but some had permanent residency, and they were honoured as the ancestors, and they were thought to live between the fireplace and the wall. So somewhere along the chimney breast, that was their dwelling place, and that's why you leave offerings in that part of the house. And it's also ancestor worship. the oldest form of ancestor worship was by the fire and by the hearth. So in honouring the solitary fairy, who is your domestic house fairy, you are also honouring the great spirits of your ancestors. So when we're working with fairies, remember that to work with light elves or dark elves would bring very different results. Make sure that, of course, dark elves, dwarves are dark elves, so they're not always malignant. And the elves who dwell in the Hollow Hills are very much respected as being light beings, of angelic beings. They are said to wear cloaks of invisibility. So they live among us, but they wear invisible cloaks. It's almost as though there are two realms dwelling together, and their realm is beyond our vision. So it's not always a scary thing to work with fairies, but treat them with respect. Leave them offerings, treat nature and animals and children with respect, or you may anger them. And if you do ask them for anything, then give them a gift in return. And of course you can work with the salamanders to help you with your will. You can work with the dwarves to help you with wealth. You can work with the air spirits to help you with communication, intelligence, inspiration. And you can work with the water spirits to work for emotional health, healing, beneficial love, friendship, things like that. So they have many uses and they have many gifts to give mankind. So treat them with respect and work with them with respect, and all shall be well. Okay, well, I hope you found that of use. Thank you for listening. I hope to speak to you again soon. Bye.